It's now my pleasure to introduce our two panelists this morning. It's really a pretty unusual occasion to have representatives from both sides of a pretty polarized debate this year going on in the presidential election. But I can't think of two individuals who I would prefer to sit down with, even in the same room. I would not be concerned at all, than Secretary Vilsack and Ray Starling. We've worked together for many, many years in different capacities, and both of these gentlemen are leaders of American agriculture. They're leaders who have something important to say, and they are public servants at the very best. So let me first introduce Secretary Vilsack, who actually is no longer secretary. We heard from Secretary Perdue yesterday, but Tom Vilsack served as secretary under President Obama for 8 years. He's now over on my side of the business as president and CEO of the U.S. Dairy Export Council. So sometime, Tom, we'll have to talk about what it's like to be on the association side. Secretary Vilsack, before coming to Washington with President Obama as secretary, actually is a two-term governor of the state of Iowa. And going back in his early public service, also was a mayor of Mount Pleasant in Iowa. So welcome, Secretary Vilsack. We're glad to have you with us. Next, let me introduce Ray Starling. Ray began his career in agriculture, actually a place a number of our members have, and that's with the Future Farmers of America, FFA. Ray was one of the national officers, which is quite a feat to be elected to one of those positions. He's a native of North Carolina, and I think you'll probably hear that in his voice. Ray started out working at the North Carolina Supreme Court, where he was clerking. He worked at the Department of Agriculture in North Carolina, also in the State House, before he came to Washington, D.C. with Senator Thom Tillis from North Carolina. So Ray served as Chief of Staff to Senator Tillis. We did a lot of work together on the Hill during that time. And then he moved over to the White House as Special Advisor to President Trump for agricultural policy. Finally, Ray went back over to USDA and served as Chief of Staff to Secretary Perdue. Ray's now returned to his North Carolina roots and is actually General Counsel for the North Carolina Chamber of Commerce. So Ray, welcome to you as well.
Thank you.
So before we get started, let me tell you both, I have on my purple tie because I want to be equal opportunity here. But Ray, we're going to give you the incumbent's privilege and have you start. And then Tom and I will step back and hear what you have to say. Thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you, Tom. First of all, thanks for giving the campaigns an opportunity to do this. They're always looking for a way to spread their message, but certainly personally, thank you for inviting me as an individual to share some thoughts on behalf of the campaign. When I got the call about this and I learned that I would be juxtaposed with former Secretary Vilsack, who I respect a great deal, my first thought was, well, thanks, Mr. Stenzel. Why don't I go up against Tom Vilsack, and at the same time, why don't we schedule a game of one-on-one with LeBron James in basketball? So I feel like I'm the inexperienced one here, and I would echo some of the very same things you already said, Tom, about former Secretary Vilsack. What a great leader. What a great contributor to the ag sector, and I look forward to hearing his comments as well, and I'm grateful to sit on the stage with him in a civil conversation. So it's an honor to be with you, United Fresh, an organization that I've learned more about in the last 8 or 10 years. It's an honor to be here with Secretary Vilsack, and certainly I have to give a hat tip to Tom and his team. You have a strong team in Washington, D.C., strong leadership, strong government advocacy folks. But I suspect that is a reflection of the outstanding members of this organization, a few whom I've gotten to know and that I'll actually mention in a few moments. When I think about asking for your vote for President Trump, many thoughts go through my head, and we don't have time for all of them today. In fact, one of the saving graces of having to be on the stage up against, if you will, Tom Vilsack is it's only going to last 10 minutes. But I want to propose a framework in which to analyze this question of who deserves to occupy 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, at least for the next 4 years. I want to talk about people, then I want to talk about ideas, and I'll close with some thoughts on the bigger picture. Let me start with people. And you know this about your own business. I'm fond of the phrase that people are policy. People are how we get things done. Knowing that at the end of the day, the people you put in those slots is very important. I think I've already mentioned, I think well of Secretary Vilsack, and in many ways during the Obama administration, I would say we all owe him a debt of gratitude for sticking with us for 8 years, because I would also add that he was often all we had. Members of United Fresh, there has never been a time, at least not in the modern era, since institutions across the executive branch have included a mass of individuals as accessible, as empathetic, and as knowledgeable about production agriculture as those President Trump has appointed. Let's start with the leader of the pack, Secretary Pundit. There are few people that know his work ethic, his heart for agriculture, and his penchant for common sense the way I do. He is tough, he is sharp, he is relentless, he is tireless. I don't know about you, but for me, that sounds like qualities that epitomize the American farmer and the American agribusinessman. I recall him visiting one particular produce farm where he found himself under the steering wheel of a 270 horsepower John Deere 8270. Now, we had not planned for him to be under that steering wheel, and I have to admit, I was a little nervous about how that was going to go. I did not want to have to explain to the press how the Secretary of Ag wrecked a $250,000 tractor. But he maneuvered that tractor right where it needed to go, all across that field of produce. It was sweet potatoes. And he's had that same steady hand and ability to steer at USDA as he had that day in the tractor. But let's talk about his cabinet at USDA, the undersecretaries and the administrators who were drawn primarily from state departments of agriculture across the country. This group has also been highly accessible and has wanted to get out and meet and work with people like you. This group of people knows and knew agriculture even on day one. They often had to brief the briefers as to how things actually worked in the field. I've sat in rooms and heard that back and forth. Chances are that your United Fresh advocacy team, and again, I'd say you have a good one. I appreciate John and the relationships that he has all across Washington. But chances are that people like Tom and John and others have 10 to 15 USDA staff in their speed dials that they can reach out to when they need to. You know, I was on the outside looking in until early 2017 when I became the special assistant to the president at the White House. And there were two observations I made within the first few days of going to the White House to work for President Trump. Both of them relate to people. First, in the 8 years leading up to when I got the opportunity to serve in that role, the position of Ag Advisor to the President at the White House simply didn't exist. President Obama and Vice President Biden never filled that position. That position is not just about briefing the president, although it does involve that from time to time, but many decisions occur before they even get to that level. It's about intervening at the White House with OSTP, with OMB, with the Office of the Vice President, with the Domestic Policy Council, with the Council of Economic Advisors. It is in those rooms where policy conversations take place and where ag needs to be at the table. It took President Trump to put someone at that table and bring production agriculture's perspective to those conversations. Let's not stop at USDA and at the White House. I'm fond of saying that today's farmer has more at risk with EPA, USTR, and FDA than who's running USDA. And on that note, we've had very constructive conversations with the leaders in all of those agencies over the past 4 years, and I would expect that to continue. I wish we had more time this morning to talk about some of those. Folks, people are policy. And the Biden campaign will be hard-pressed to tell you that they're going to improve on the personnel that have had our backs in the Trump administration the last 4 years. I told you my second point was about ideas. I think almost everyone here, including Secretary Vilsack and I, would tell you that we need more ideas and less ideology. So I want to mention a couple of ideas that I think impact every one of you watching this presentation. The first relates to the role that USDA plays in procuring food for people who can't afford it. Back in 2017, the president and USDA proposed something they called the Harvest Box Program, which was designed to lower the cost of providing food to those receiving SNAP benefits. We were literally laughed out of the room. I mean, who could possibly imagine that a program that combines balanced nutrition, nutritious product offerings in a single box with the help of nonprofits and public-private partnerships. Who could have ever imagined that that would catch on? What a silly idea. Fast forward 3 years, and in the middle of COVID, USDA's Farmer to Families Food Box program is at $3 billion in investment and will ultimately eclipse $4 billion. It's been an extraordinarily artful way to supplant food service demand loss, to take pressure off traditional venues for food assistance like food banks and similar services. And it gets farmers, it gets you directly in on the action. It is win, win, win. So go back to that 2017 Harvest Box proposal. It was an idea simply ahead of its time. And I hope that it remains for many, many years to come. The second idea that I'd mention here is the president's positioning of the United States relative to China. And certainly, let me be on record as saying we appreciate the Chinese people and their contributions to humankind and the hopeful diplomatic friendliness that we share with them about making the world a better place to live. But what you're going to hear from the anti-Trump crowd is that that relationship has been a disaster. That the way we've approached that has caused reputational risk around the world, and that the tariffs the Chinese have imposed and the tariffs the Americans have imposed have been catastrophic for American agriculture. Let me tell you what would have been catastrophic for American agriculture. Continuing to look the other way while the Bonnie and Clydes of world trade play by one set of rules and we play by the set that we actually negotiated and agreed to. That would be and continue to be catastrophic. An unchecked trade imbalance with one trading partner that eclipsed $400 billion annually, waiting until it hit 600, waiting until it hit 700 billion before realizing and taking action on some rebalancing. That would have been catastrophic. Put differently, being an elite fit-in, a fanboy of unchecked globalization is what would have been catastrophic. To deny that this needed some attention is simply to be out of touch with reality. You might as well be writing about the successes of communism in the 1970s and the 1980s. Ignoring all of that and the structural reform that needed to occur, and trusting that multilateral agreement or sending more money to three-letter named organizations was going to solve the problem, the very reasons we got to where we are. Folks, that's the stuff that rainbows, fairy tales, and unicorns eat for breakfast. To put it bluntly, President Trump was the voice in the wilderness calling for a check and a balance on our trade relationships with China and beyond when others' efforts had not shown much progress. But again, asking China to step up to the plate was an idea ahead of its time. But there's a success story here. And there's more to say on trade. USMCA becoming the gold standard that will now basically be the acolyte for the remainder of what we do trade-wise. The US-Japanese agreement, including massive wins for agriculture, wins that were forethoughts in that conversation and negotiation, not afterthoughts, and doing so in a package that didn't even need congressional approval. Progress and positioning with the UK, which I believe will ultimately bear fruit. In a sentence, in 4 years, this administration has renegotiated the playing field for 47% of the U.S. ag export marketplace, which is simply unprecedented. In every single percentage of that 47, we are better off than we were 4 years ago. These were good ideas. Now let me tell you about some bad ideas. I've stood in the parking lot, and Dana, I appreciated your sponsorship here this morning. I've stood in the parking lot of Grimmway Farms out in California, and I've seen the forced carpooling of packing house employees that's a result of regulatory overreach. I've stood near the road there at that facility where someone explained to me that the California Climate Police have threatened to ticket tractor-trailer drivers hauling the lifeblood of American ag products, nutritious and perishable produce, because those trucks were idling too long before they could get into the facility. Ladies and gentlemen, these are not the ideas and inventions of this president and his team, nor have they found safe haven here. In fact, this president and his team have done as much as the courts have let them do to stem the tide of regulatory onslaught that began the last time Joe Biden stumbled regularly through the White House. But if you want Kamala Harris and California-style regulations to become the norm, then Biden may be your guy. It's about ideas, folks. And when it comes to agriculture, I encourage you to ask Mr. Biden what his are. Finally, I told you I'd mention the bigger picture. Those of us in agriculture, we like to talk about agriculture. We could talk about it all day long. But there's a lot at stake here outside of agriculture. Supreme Court appointments is at the top of the list. In fact, if the President and the United States Senate do what they are constitutionally and legally permitted to do over the next 100 days, the other side has told you they're going to blow the whole thing up. Taxes. The Vice President has made no bones about it. He wants to raise taxes, and he wants to raise United Fresh members your taxes. Now, if you believe that won't impact you and you want to send more of your money to Washington to be given to someone else, then by all means, Mr. Biden may be your guy. The Green New Deal. I don't even know where Mr. Biden is or what he said about that, but I doubt he has distanced himself from it. The return of czars to the White House, unconfirmed superdelegates that get to tell cabinet secretaries like Secretary Vilsack what to think about climate change and environmental regulations and how to spend their own department's budgets. If you like accessible folks that you can hold accountable like Sonny Perdue and Greg Ibaugh, like Greg Dowd at USTR, vote for Trump. If you like czars, vote for the other guy. Labor cost, and I could go on all day about this. My family are H-2A users, and it has all but run us out of the business, what American labor costs these days. Both administrations need to commit to do more on that topic, but Congress has got to get in the game as well. Ag labor is absolutely a problem Congress is going to have to fix, and the President Trump has signaled he's more than ready for that conversation. Tom, it's about people, it's about ideas, and it's about putting it all in context of a bigger picture. I've worn out my welcome, but I've given you some food for thought. And again, I appreciate the opportunity to be here with Secretary Vilsack, and I certainly look forward to respectfully hearing his remarks.
Ray, thank you so much for joining us. And now, Secretary Vilsack, if we could hear your perspective.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks for the opportunity as well. It's really a privilege to be with all of you today. Certainly want to thank Ray for those kind words. I will tell you that he has had experience in the toughest job at the USDA, with all due respect to Secretary Perdue or any previous secretary. Being chief of staff to a cabinet member is really a tough job. That's the job where you have to say no and you allow the boss to say yes. So I appreciate his kind words and appreciate his service, his public service, both at USDA, at the White House, as well as in Congress. And certainly want to express my appreciation to Tom and his team for the opportunity to be with you today and for the great work that they do on behalf of the producers of this country and those who are involved in distributing and making sure that our families have access to tremendously healthy and nutritious food. I want to thank all of you for your role in making sure that we are a healthier nation. Certainly want to appreciate the opportunity to visit with you today on behalf of Joe Biden. And if Joe were here, I think he would explain to you that he has been the senator and vice president hailing from Delaware, a state that sometimes people fail to recognize is indeed an agricultural state. He'd tell you about the Delmarva Peninsula. He'd talk to you about the fruits and vegetables and products that are grown in his state with a great deal of pride. And I think he does understand the important role that farmers play and our food distribution system plays. After all, the food and agriculture industry is a large industry. It represents roughly 20% of the American workforce, either directly or indirectly, and impacts roughly over 20% of the American economy. So it is an incredibly important industry, and Vice President Biden fully understands and appreciates that. You know, if he were here, I think he would say the first job of the next administration is to do what this administration hasn't been able to do, which is to control the virus. You know, the reality is the virus has impacted every single American. Tragically, we've lost several 100,000 Americans and will likely lose tens of thousands of more Americans as a result of the virus. We have millions of our fellow Americans who are dealing right now with the consequences of the virus. So it's going to be important and necessary for the administration, the next administration, to take an aggressive effort to control the virus so that we get back to the new normal. Now, that means we need an aggressive effort with reference to the safety measures that we know work, whether it's mask or protective equipment, or whether it's making so that we socially distance. All of that is incredibly important of protecting each other, of doing to others what we wish done to us to protect our families. This administration would also, the Biden administration would also make sure that we saw not just a rapid utilization of a vaccine, but a safe and effective utilization of a vaccine, and done in an equitable and fair way. It's not necessarily a simple thing to make sure that all Americans ultimately have access as quickly as possible to a safe and effective vaccine. Well, once we've done that, I think the Vice President's focus will definitely be on building back better. He often talks about that. And what will that mean to United Fresh and to the folks who are involved in this association? Well, first of all, I think it will mean building a much more resilient supply chain. We saw a significant disruption during the course of this virus from our food service being basically stopped in its tracks. And it took some time for us to be able to redirect. Unfortunately and tragically, we saw farmers and producers across the country who didn't have an incentive to donate at the time were forced to dump and destroy. That was really heartbreaking for all of us to watch. So what we need is a more resilient supply chain. It starts with making sure that the food banks and the pantries have the capacity, the refrigeration capacity, and the ability to store perishable foods in a meaningful way, so that we have that ability to pivot more quickly from food service to food banks if necessary. Vice President is very keen on making sure that we invest in infrastructure. This was a promise that President Trump made that he hasn't kept, to improve America's infrastructure. And is that important to Americans' farmers? You bet, because it's essentially our competitive advantage in terms of pricing of our products. The ability to get product to market more efficiently and more effectively needs the need for new bridges, new roads, new rail, new ports, new inland water systems, new airports, all designed to provide opportunities not only to create jobs for those who unfortunately have found themselves unemployed at this point, but also to make sure that we have the most modern, most up-to-date, most efficient, and most effective infrastructure to get product to market more effectively. I think Vice President Biden understands the importance of markets to farmers, and I think you're going to see the opportunity to expand market opportunity for fresh produce. What does that involve? Well, it does involve indeed working with the SNAP program and the WIC program and the school lunch program to provide access to in greater amounts and greater opportunities for fresh fruits and vegetables to be available to our families and to our children. I think you'll see a concerted effort on the part of the Biden administration, as you did with the Obama administration. It's interesting to note some of the concerns that Ray expressed about the Obama administration. I never had a problem talking to President Obama about agriculture. I always had an opportunity to visit with him. And in fact, we always celebrated the fact that during his administration, we had the highest farm income in record. We also had the highest farm exports in record. And speaking of exports, it's going to be important and necessary for us to have a smart and effective trade policy. I don't disagree with Ray when he talks about the necessity of going after China. I think the big mistake that was made was that we went alone. We didn't take the time to build an alliance of nations focused on basically who are all being treated in the same unfair way by China, to basically go and present to them a world community that suggested there was a need for change. By going it alone, essentially what we saw was a big target being placed on the back of American agriculture and farmers. And what did the Chinese do? They assessed retaliatory tariffs. What did that do? It significantly impacted and affected exports to China. Now with phase one agreement, we're celebrating that, but the problem is that China is buying those products at reduced prices because they drove surpluses up by the retaliatory tariffs. A smart, more effective trade policy would be to make sure that we had opportunities to go with the world community so that we didn't put a target on the back of our farmers, ranchers, and producers. And in addition to exports, we also want to make sure that we continue to look for ways in which we can expand local and regional food systems that enable local schools, hospitals, institutional purchasers of food to more easily purchase fresh fruit and vegetables, providing them resources and incentives to do so. That's part of the Biden plan to rebuild back better and to revitalize the rural economy. You know, Ray mentioned workforce, and clearly I think we have an agreement on this, which is that we need to have a stable workforce. But to do that, we really truly need true immigration reform. We need strong borders for sure, but we also need a stable workforce. And that means fixing the broken immigration system, which has not been fixed during the course of the Trump administration. And in fact, very little of that wall has been built while we're at it. Now, the reality is we need a true immigration reform that basically provides agriculture a stable and secure workforce, predictable workforce at an affordable cost. And I think, frankly, Ray mentioned the Green Deal. Well, I think the Vice President's been very clear about that. He hasn't embraced the Green Deal, he's embraced the Biden deal. And let me talk to you about that, what that is. It's really designed to mitigate the next disruption that could occur to our economy as a result of climate change. Farmers understand and appreciate that probably better than just about anybody else because they are dealing with longer droughts, more severe floods, and now horrific forest fires, all of which are directly connected and related, not just to weather, but also climate change. What would the Biden administration do? Well, the Biden administration would look for an opportunity to create new income for farmers by investing in conservation practices that we know will provide healthier soil and cleaner water, expanded investments, additional investments beyond what has been done in the past, placing more resources in publicly financed research so that we have a better understanding of how to use less water or how to use our soil in ways that are most effective to produce productivity and production. And paying farmers for carbon storage. This is really an important point. If we're really serious about climate, if we're really serious about reducing emissions, if we're really serious about providing international leadership in this space, we have to understand and appreciate the role that farmers and rural landowners can play in sequestering and storing carbon. But the Biden administration understands that in order to do that, you need to incent farmers, you need to pay farmers, you need to create a revenue stream for farmers that creates new opportunities. So when there is a disruption in the food supply chain, there's also continued income coming into farmers because their land is being used for a benefit that benefits all of us. And clearly we should pay for that benefit. And the ability to convert agricultural waste, which for many farmers ultimately becomes an issue or problem, an expense, now becomes an opportunity to create new ways of converting that agricultural waste into a wide variety of materials and chemicals, fabrics and fibers and fuel and energy. An opportunity to create significantly greater income opportunities, a variety of opportunities on the farm. This will not only help to create farm income and stabilize farm income, but it will also create jobs in rural places. I think the Vice President understands and appreciates the emotional stress that folks in rural America have experienced because they have seen too many of their sons and daughters leave their farm, leave their small town, because they felt that there was opportunity elsewhere. This new opportunity that the Biden administration is talking about, where American agriculture leads the world, ultimately in getting to net zero emissions by increasing income and by incenting these kinds of activities, will provide us not just additional income, but will also provide us a market opportunity because more and more consumers here in the United States and around the world are very interested in making sure that what is being produced is being sustainably produced and being produced in a way that doesn't necessarily contribute to any additional environmental harm. Ray mentioned regulation. The Vice President's been very clear about that. In his administration, what he would see is a need for a greater transparency in regulatory activities, a more inclusive and more collaborative effort to embrace and to encourage those who might potentially be regulated to be part of the conversation, to be part of how regulations could be crafted in a way that makes sense. Clear regulations, very clear regulations, a greater clarity in regulations, and also assistance with implementation, understanding and appreciating that farmers are a little bit different than a lot of businesses. They don't necessarily have the ability to impact and affect the price that they get for their product. They can't go to the elevator or can't go and basically say they want a nickel more. They basically have to take the price that's set by the market. They don't have a lot of control over inputs, as you well know, input costs. So the reality is that regulations ultimately affect the bottom line. And so in order to do this, we need to figure out ways in which farmers can be assisted in implementation if there is a regulation. Let me just conclude by saying that I think the Vice President's principal goal in a Biden-Harris administration is to create a much less divisive and divided nation. I think if he were here today, he would say to you that there is no problem, no issue, no situation that is too difficult for the United States of America to tackle as long as we are united. And I think the Vice President feels very, very clearly and very strongly about the importance of bringing folks together and not bringing and pulling them apart. And I think this stems in large part, because of the personal sufferings that he's suffered as a result of the loss of family members. I think he has decided to deal with that grief of that in a way that creates the opportunity to heal this nation. He can't bring his children back. He can't bring his first wife back, but what he can do is bring this country back. And I think that's a very important consideration as you think about the next 4 years and you think about the future of this country. Ask yourself whether we will be a better country, a stronger country, a more forceful country in international affairs if we are divided or if we are united. Thank you very much.
Secretary Vilsack, thank you so much. Ray, I'd like to invite you back on with us, and we've got a few minutes for any closing comments. So Ray, you want to go first?
Well, I think, and again, appreciate the opportunity to be here alongside Secretary Vilsack, and such a civil and thoughtful guy to have these conversations with. I would react to just one thing that he said, and I would use this talking point if I were President Obama, or candidate Biden as well, or President Obama. That comment about net farm income hitting an all-time high. Back when we had $8 corn and $14 and $15 soybeans. I would definitely take credit for that if my party had been president during that time. But a different statistic that I would point out is between 2012 and 2016. So in the very course of when the Obama-Biden administration should have been humming at its best, net farm income, absent direct payments, in the United States actually fell from about $86 billion annually to about 50. That was a drop of 42% of net farm income over that second term that Mr. Biden was a part of the administration. If you wanted to be even less charitable, look at the numbers between 2013 and 2016, and the drop is closer to 56%. So that's fair to ask then what has happened since 2016 going forward to 2020. That same measure, net farm income, exclusive of direct federal government payments, has gone back up 33% from 49 billion up to about 65.5 billion. And so at the end of the day, we recognize it is about the numbers, that you can take patriotism and hope and decency to the bank, but they're still going to want to see your net profit and loss statement when they're considering making that loan. And I think this is a place where Secretary Vilsack and I would totally agree. This next comment, and then I'll hush Tom. We do have a challenge in agriculture with all of the assistance that we've received over the course of the last 3 or 4 years. Now, not a lot of that had flowed to the typical United Fresh member until, of course, these COVID intervention had started. And no one's criticizing or saying that that shouldn't have happened. But I do think we have a hard conversation to have, Republicans and Democrats, about what is the off-ramp here in terms of the massive amount of government assistance that has flowed to farmers, either through COVID payments, through market facilitation payments, through the CCC, or even farm bill and crop insurance payments. We've asked a lot as a community over the last 3 or 4 years, and I think we're going to have a serious conversation about coming off that cliff and doing that as a sloped dive as opposed to falling directly off. And, my plea would just be that, I think a Trump administration would help us do that peacefully and again, in a sloped fashion as opposed to simply cutting that aid off. I think we all are going to have to, as policymakers, think through, how do we do that? This is not really where we want to be. And frankly, both parties, have been a part of that conversation. Initially, certainly fair to say that was President Trump's work, but we've been through several appropriations packages now where it's really got everybody's fingerprints on it, and we need to put everybody's fingerprints on it to fix it.
Ray, thank you. And Secretary Vilsack, we're going to give you the last word.
Well, thanks, Tom. Appreciate the opportunity. Ray, thanks again for being part of this conversation. Certainly informative, and appreciate again the kind words that you provided. I would say if we're going to play with numbers, we need to talk about exports, Ray, because that's an important consideration for farmers. 30% of what we grow and raise in this country is exported, and 20% of our farm income is directly related to exports. And the question is, how are we doing on exports? Are we continuing to have that ag surplus that we've so enjoyed over the course of many years? The reality is, in the Trump administration, we've seen an erosion of that trade surplus. In other words, we used to be able to say with some degree of predictability that we were going to have a $20-25 billion trade surplus in agriculture. We've been able to say that we've had a large ag surplus in exports, ag trade, for over 60 years. And today, what we're looking at is significant reductions in that surplus to the point where we actually could risk being, for the first time in 6 years, not having an ag surplus on exports. Now, why is that? Well, it's because the trade policies of the Trump administration have created a series of barriers that have made it incredibly difficult for us to do business with some of our customers. So it's important and necessary as we look at numbers to look at the total picture. And I am proud of the fact that we had record income, and we saw a continuation and opportunity. And I think the idea here is that the Biden response to Ray's challenge of what do we do to get off 35 to 40% of ag income now coming from the government. And the reality is that most farmers I know don't want that government check. They want markets, right? They want markets. And I think what the Biden administration is suggesting is that not just do we expand traditional markets, not just do we continue to look for expanded exports and continue to look for local and regional food systems and encourage more consumption of fruits and vegetables in a variety of different ways that we can do that. But we also have to look at ways in which we can utilize our natural resource advantage more forcefully, more effectively, and more profitably for farmers by allowing them and paying them for carbon sequestration, by creating opportunities to convert agricultural waste into a variety of products in which basically you're now selling that waste, not having to deal with how to get rid of it. So I think the key here is a Biden administration understands and appreciates the long-term future of agriculture requires us to expand significantly conventional markets, but also to create new markets, new non-traditional markets. And I think that's the opportunity of the future.
And with that, I'm afraid we're going to have to wrap this session, but Secretary Vilsack, Ray, thank you so much for joining us. You've given us all a lot to think about. Tonight at 6 o'clock Eastern time, we're going to have our election night party on Zoom, and we're actually going to vote. So we'll be sure to let both of you know how the vote turned out among our members. So thank you again for joining us.